Hello and welcome. In this talk, I will talk about Painless Vue Forms with vee-validate. So first, a little bit about me. I'm Abdelrahman Awad, Senior Front-End Engineer at Octopus. I'm based in Cairo, Egypt, and I created and maintain vee-validate since 2016. I write about Vue.js, TypeScript, and JavaScript on my blog, logarithm.com. So check it out if you are interested in that type of content. Also, give me a follow on Twitter at logarithm. So forms are pain in the, well, thorn in your side. But let's dive deeper into what makes them such a pain. So most JavaScript form libraries seem to agree on the kind of pain points that forms should be, that makes forms hard, what they should tackle. And some libraries tackle most of these issues, some make it easier. So let's have a better understanding of each of them. First, you have the issue of value tracking, which involves how are you going to sync the input values with the data model that you have in memory, if you have one. And how are you going to retrieve these values, so the input values, and submit them or consume them in any other meaningful way, like sending them to the server. There is also the matter of validation. How are you going to express your validation intent? You can go a declarative approach and do it like native HTML, or you can go JavaScript approach and do it explicitly in your JavaScript. There is also the matter of generating the error messages for these validation rules, and it can be really complicated, especially with localization and stuff like that. There is also the matter of integration, how easy it is to introduce such a library into your workflow, and how much is it easy to swap it out, or what kind of changes do you need to do to get it working. There is also the UI and UX aspect. How does the library help you craft these beautiful experiences for your users? Because after all, if your form is frustrating, it won't do its main job, which is collecting values. Because believe it or not, users won't bother dealing with a frustrating form. There is also the debugging developer experience, which is almost non-existent in most validation libraries, but in general, when something goes wrong, how are you going to find out? How are you going to fix it? How are you going to properly debug it? Are you going to just use logs and print stuff to the screen so you can figure out what's going on? Or are there any type of advanced tools that you can use? So vee-validate try to take a stab at each of these, but first let's talk about it. Currently, vee-validate, it is the most popular Vue.js form validation library with around 1.4 million downloads per month and 8.6K stars on GitHub. So let's talk about the 101 of vee-validate version 4. So first you have the form component and the field component, and their usage is pretty straightforward. You use form component to create forms, use field component to create fields inside these form components. So let's talk about value tracking. Right here we have a very basic form created in pure Vue.js, and you usually always have these three parts. Notice that I have put the script tag first before the template because it makes more sense when you are thinking about how are you declaring or how are you creating these forms in Vue.js. So let's review the main parts that we have. First, you have the state declaration. So you declare what your form will contain, right? It can be string values, it can be whatever you want. You also have this part, which is the consumption of these values or the retrieval of these values. So right here, we send it to an imaginary API and we grab the values using the Vue instance accessor, this.form. Then you have the last step of binding these values that you just declared into their appropriate inputs. So each input will update the values using some form of two-way binding or even one-way binding, depending on what you actually need. With Vue.js, it's really easy. With vmodel, achieves two-way binding really easily. However, there is some issues with this approach because right here we have some kind of friction. Let's say we wanted to add another field, like a name field. When you add that field, you'll have to declare it and you have to retrieve it and you have to bind the state. If you mess up any of these steps, your form won't work as expected. So Also, the issue of cleaning it up. So let's say you want to remove that field that you added because the backend no longer needs it. So you remove it, then you have to clean up the values in the template. Sorry, you have to declare the values in the declaration. You have to clean up the template, and you have to remove it from your retrieval. So you remove all references to it basically. So this can become quite tedious and redundant. So what vee-validate will do for you is it rethinks about what it should offer. And in terms of value tracking, it never did that before, but with Vue 3 and version 4, it does that. And right here, what vee-validate will allow you to do is you declare your fields inside a form component using the field component. So, and you give them a name. So the name can be just like your models, an email and a password. Vee-validate will take that hint and will implicitly create a model declaration and bind it to the render output of these components. So it will do everything you saw we did in that last example. It will also give you access to these values in the submit function, which is actually almost always the only place that you need it. Most of the time you don't need access to the values anywhere else. You only need them when you submit them, so you can actually send them to your server using fetch or whatever. So what vee-validate will do here is it optimizes that for you, and you will actually notice we are not using vmodel at all. We are not declaring any state at all, and it still works. The reactivity, everything still works. And this is the main design philosophy of vee-validate, taking the declarative approach to the next level by completely removing the state from your code. And you can still use vmodel if you really want to with your field components, and it still works. So it just made vmodel not required anymore, like it kinda used to be. It's not, but it kinda used to be to most Vue.js beginners. So with nested values, it's even more amazing because you can specify a path for the field name. So you want to create this kind of formatted value in a specific shape that you want to send to the backend. So you don't need to move stuff around. You don't need to pack and unpack some values so you can properly send them to the backend. You no longer need to process them. So all you have to do is specify the path where you need the values to end up in. And vee-validate will take care of that. It will walk down that path, create any arrays and objects along the way, and put your values there. Bonus thing here is if you are using the new Vue 3.2 script setup, you get this really minimal API to build your forms. Here, this is really an actual working form with just the code that you see. So let's talk about the main issue here, which is validation. Realizing that there can't be a single way to express validation to satisfy all the developers' needs, because there is always someone with a different experience needing some kind of different way to declare validation. So I have thought of that there are about 3 ways that are reasonable to support out of the box, and that's what vee-validate does. So at its very basic level, vee-validate supports JavaScript functions and libraries. So you can grab in or write your own functions and use them to validate your inputs, or grab third-party libraries like Validator and use it to validate the inputs. You also have backend-inspired string expressions, which what made vee-validate popular in the first place, the Laravel validation syntax. It is string-based, it is compact, and it is really easy to understand. However, it has this kind of overhead when you have to import everything and use it. When you have to import everything, and forces you to do this boilerplate where everything should be defined beforehand, which isn't friendly on your bundle size and thus isn't friendly on your application speed, but it's really useful if you are building an admin dashboard or something like that. Then we have schema validators, which are really nice because they open the door into creating really powerful and interactive schemas where you have conditional validation rules really easily without really having to juggle all around a bunch of logic and having to write custom stuff. So stuff like libraries like Yub and Zod are really good at doing this, and vee-validate supports them out of the box. So when using JavaScript function for validation, you have this example. When you have a normal JavaScript function that receives a value, checks if it's empty or not, then checks if it's an email or not, and returns a string as an error message in each stage, which is really straightforward. For Laravel expression, it is even easier. You just declare your fields globally, usually in your entry point file like main.js or whatever, and then you can use them as strings and pass them to the rules property. You just say it is a required pipe email, which means this field should be a required email. The validation with using yup schemas is very similar. You grab the string schema from yup and you construct your string schema. So you construct a string that should be an email and it is required. You pass that to vee-validate's rules and it just works. Again, libraries like yup open the door for form schemas because now you can describe the entirety of your form using their object validators. Here in this example, we are importing the object schema validator from yup, and we are constructing a form schema. This form schema is an object that contains an email that is a string, it is an email, and it is required, and a password field that it is a string, has minimum of 6 characters, and it is also required. And you pass that with a validation schema property to the form component, and you no longer have to specify any validation rules to your fields. You are done. So this makes it really easy and reduces the maintenance burden of having to juggle a lot of rules in your script, then passing them correctly to your template. Now you only need to worry about writing the correct rules and declaring your fields in the template. Let's talk about the integration aspect. So to be fair, vee-validate wasn't very friendly towards some use cases. For example, there are a lot of people who just use JavaScript to sprinkle some interactive parts into their application, sprinkling some JavaScript magic to make some stuff interactive. Forms are no exception. But vee-validate was kind of hostile towards them because it was hard to grab it from a CDN and just use it because it had some dependencies. So this is different now because vee-validate now tries to follow closely the progressive aspect of Vue.js. It is a progressive JavaScript framework, so vee-validate should support both ends of the spectrum. It should at least be easily incrementable from the most basic use case to the most advanced use case. And this is a fair example for doing that. This is a normal form that uses the native page reload submissions, which is a native submission behavior, and submits these fields using the post method to that register endpoint. This is usually what you have in your typical backend application without any kind of single page application magic or server rendered single page applications. So with vee-validate, all you have to do is just replace the form element with the form component, replace the input element with the field component, and you are done. Just add some error message components for error display, and that's it. Of course, you have to specify the validation schema, but once you do that, vee-validate will do a smart thing here. When the user fills the fields and submits the form, vee-validate will check the fields, check if they are valid, and if they are valid, it will behave as if there isn't any JavaScript at all. It will just submit the form using the native behavior. So it will reload the page and it will hit that action endpoint with that method. So native form behavior. However, if any of the fields turns out invalid, then it will do a very different thing. It will prevent the submission and it will display the error messages. So it gave you that client-side validation magic without really having to invest in your JavaScript a lot. Right here, this is a fully fledged example. All they have to do is just add a validation schema and that's it. That's all JavaScript they actually need. Of course, given that they are using Vue.js. So let's talk a little bit about UI and UX. While vee-validate doesn't offer a lot in terms of UI and UX, it offers you the primitives that allow you to build whatever experiences that you want. For example, in this example, we are using the scoped slots to access certain information about the field. For example, we want to access the meta, which contains a bunch of Boolean flags that are very helpful in determining various information about the field, like if it is valid, if it has been touched or blurred, or if it is dirty, so its value has changed, and other information like that. So in this example, we are just applying some classes based on these Boolean flags, but you can do much more. In this example, the form has similar Boolean flags and other information. For example, right here, I have 3 different use cases that are common in most forms today. So vee-validate has this is submitting Boolean flag that you can use in your forms, and it actually tracks well with the submit handler. So if your submit handler is actually asynchronous, so you can use async and await or promises, vee-validate will actually wait for that promise before toggling that submitting value to false. So it actually syncs well with your submission progress. And that can be really useful if you want to display some kind of a spinner, or if you just want to disable the submit button, just like this example. Another example is we disable the submit button if we have any invalid fields. Another example is we disable the button until the user has, and if the user values didn't change. Another example right here is vee-validate also reports invalid submission attempts using events. So if your user tried to submit this form and it failed, you can actually hook into that using a handler and do some custom logic. This is very useful when you have this very large form where the users can't actually see most of the elements. So if some element up there outside the viewport is invalid, they can't actually see it to correct it, right? So a really nice way to do it is to give them some feedback or just scroll to that field, just like this example. Now let's talk about field arrays. Field arrays are unique in the way that they are repeatable fields, meaning there isn't just a unique instance of them, there can be multiple. And the issue with them is, as you can see, you create them by having some kind of data model as an array and you iterate on that array. But the problem here is if the elements were to change index, then the index isn't good enough of a unique identifier for that iteration loop. That means you have to create a unique property. And since you can't do that on primitive values like strings, so you need to create a wrapping object, and that object will contain both your value and the unique property. In this case, it is an ID, and it can be generated using timestamps. Like you can see here, it is good enough. In some cases, you may want to opt in for a more robust way of generating them. Now, the problem with this is it is a kind of friction that you have to do this every single time. You need to create this kind of fields. Also, you need to clean up these properties eventually because your backend doesn't really care about that uniqueness aspect and they only care about the raw values. So you will end up having to omit these properties and extracting the actual values that your API needs. Now, what vee-validate does here for you is it exposes a component called field array, and this component actually offers you all the tools you need to do this. For example, it manages the state entirely, and it is entirely isolated within it, meaning it gives you the fields that you should iterate on, and for each entry, it generates a unique key property. And this key is automatically generated. You don't have to be involved in it at all. So right here in this example, we are using the entry, which is one of the elements in the fields array, and we are just using the key property, which is automatically generated for you. And as long as you are using the methods provided by the field array component, then you shouldn't worry about that anymore. And that means you can deal with your fields as primitives. For example, we are just pushing primitive strings here. So vee-validate will take that, wrap it an object, create a unique ID, and add it to the array. So all of that is done for you. Now let's talk about form generators. Form generators, while vee-validate doesn't offer a lot of utility for them, however, you can build your own. And there is actually an example in the documentation from start to finish on how to do that. However, you can use special libraries that are really good at doing so, and that has first-party integration with vee-validate, like Viewlate. Now, moving on to the composition API. So far, you have seen only the components being used in the demos, but vee-validate components are actually built using the composition API, meaning the components are actually one implementation possible for these composition functions. That means that you can use whatever flavor that you need, either the composition flavor or the component flavor. And you can mix and match between them because after all, they are basically the same. In this example, I have a custom field implemented using useField. And this useField function creates a field context for that component, and it gives you information, all the information you need for that field. For example, the value and the error message. And right here, we are doing the two-way binding ourselves because it no longer is done automatically for you because you opted in to use useField, which is more of a manual way of doing things, but it is also extremely more flexible than the field component. So once we used it, you can actually create your own way of declaring your form. For example, instead of having all that markup for 3 fields, now you can have a 3-liner to do the same thing. Now, the same can be done with forms. So useForm actually allows you to create a form context, and that form context will grab any fields created inside it, child fields or components created using useField, and it will manage them for you exactly as the form component did. So you can mix and match between them, and they all work splendidly. And check the documentation of when you should use the components API or the composition API. Now let's talk about the final aspect in this talk, which is the Vue.js dev tools. Now, the debugging experience with forms is lackluster in most cases, but with the Vue.js dev tools, the new one, authors like me can actually hook into the Vue dev tools and offer new functionalities and new inspectors. In this example, we have this forum that is created using vee-validate components, and just by using vee-validate components or the composition API, you automatically get access to a new inspector called vee-validate. If you click on it, it gives you access to the form currently rendered and any field elements belonging to it. When you click on each of these nodes, you get the summary of that field or forum. So you get summary of the state right here. One nice thing about this, if I submit here and I have no idea what's going on, I can always check the dev tools and I can see the errors in the forum and I can see the errors for each field. Now, if I type the values in, you'll notice the tags turning to green. This gives you at a glance the validity of each element. So if something isn't quite right, you can tell that at a glance and fix it if it's a bug or actually verify if it's working correctly. So this is one cool thing. Another cool thing is you can actually reset things right here from the dev tools. So I'm resetting the email field, so everything turns to invalid again, and I can reset the entire form. I can force validate a specific field, just like this one, or I can force validate the entire thing, and I can reset it again. So it's really neat and gives you a lot of flexibility when dealing with forms. Now, what's next? Well, we don't really have solid plans yet, but multi-step forms are, I'm eyeing that one, and I'm not sure yet what can be done here. Maybe we'll integrate with another library that really does a great job at doing this, and offering more examples for the AI libraries in general, the popular ones like Vuetify, as they become ready for Vue 3. You can check the documentation for the existing ones and for more information. Now I'll be answering any questions that you have. Well, thank you for having me.